Premiere for Sabura last night, which is our first Italian original, and we're super excited about it and the reception it received, but we're sleep deprived. So the question of what is an international originals, some background for that is a couple of years ago, we were talking as a business that we were expecting well over half of our subscribers to be outside of the US, but all of our, or most of our productions were English language and based in the US. And there was an inconsistency to lining up our programming with our future audience. So I went to my boss, Ted, who runs content for the company, and said, you know, we should really be starting to build this muscle of making productions around the world. We had this opportunity to do a show in Mexico with Ghazal Zaraki, who had made the #1 film in Mexico that year, or a couple of years before. So we did this show, we commissioned this show called Club de Cuervos, which was a comedy set in the world of soccer. It's a brother and sister fighting over the inheritance of who's going to own this football team. And the big takeaway for us was that it was our #1 show in Mexico at the time by far, so bigger than House of Cards, bigger than Orange, bigger than all the other shows that we were doing at the time, but that it also traveled, and that it shouldn't have surprised us, but it did. And it really emboldened us to think that we shouldn't just be thinking about the strategy of doing international originals for particular markets, which was obvious, but that we were going to be participating in this global production environment where people were really going to want to see shows from around the world in different languages, from different cultures. So since that time, we've commissioned 75 projects that we're going to be rolling out over the next 5 quarters. So think of it as us having, and that includes things like anime, it includes things like big stand-up shows, some films, but mostly it's scripted series. So at least once a week for the rest of the tenure of Netflix, we're going to have an international original coming through our portfolio, right? And we're defining an international original as something that is produced basically outside of the US. Most of it is not in English language, for which we have global distribution rights. So in addition to the strategy that I'll talk about today, we do co-productions and first-run licensing. And in fact, within Europe, we've spent, since 2012, about $2 billion on co-productions, originals, and first-run licensing. And have over 100, we've participated in over 100 projects in Europe since that time. So that's kind of the groundwork of how we got started. There's a few things I want to talk about today that impact this strategy. So one thing that comes up often in the US is, are we at peak TV? And I don't know if this is such a buzzy term in Europe.
No, I think you may want to explain what that is.
Okay, so when we talk about peak TV in the US, there's this idea that there's a variety of new entrants into the market, us and Amazon and Apple and whomever, and that there's a whole bunch of scripted shows being made, and will there be consumer demand for the hundreds of new TV series that are going to be made? The question presupposes that audience tastes are all the same and that we're all on one network watching the same thing, which we don't believe at all. So we think that TV audiences are going to be defined in a completely different way over the next 10 or 15 years. So when we define global TV audiences, Netflix now has over 100 million subscribers, and half of them are outside of the US, we really start to think about our audiences less on a channel basis and more by taste. So for example, people don't think of, in the US at least, of anime as being a global TV genre that's super important. But in fact for us, when you think about adding up the audiences in Japan and France and Brazil and the US that watch anime, you're talking about numbers that are multi-millions, that are bigger than a lot of scripted shows that are commonly discussed in the US and here as well. Yesterday when we launched Sabura, we put out a trailer for the show, and in Brazil, 26,000 people watched it over the first 15 or 20 hours. It's not the 26,000 that matters, it's the signal that there's groups of people who are looking for particular genres. And so, the people in Brazil know nothing about what's happening in Italian production, they know nothing about these shows. For the most part, they're just gravitating towards something that's interesting to them that relates to, maybe they've been fans of Narcos, maybe they've been fans of other shows, but if you think about it, we're at an extraordinary moment where, and it's not just a Netflix moment, where there hasn't been an opportunity to distribute things globally at the same time. So if there's 26,000 people in Brazil watching this trailer, and there's a few thousand people in France, and there's people in Japan, we're thinking about the collective audience for that show, and of course we're thinking about Italy as well. But it's this really unique opportunity to gather audiences in a different way. A few other examples to think about. We released a show in Brazil called 3%, which was a little bit like a Hunger Games sci-fi show. Not an expensive show for us, but more people watch that show outside of Brazil. Brazil's a big market for us than in Brazil. And in fact, if you looked at the numbers for that show in the US alone, it would have been a super successful number for any cable channel in the US. And why is that? I don't really know, but I think something about it is that the cast looked very different, there was a different point of view, and it felt authentic, and it felt like, unlike things that are traditionally on US TV. And, by the way, it was also dubbed in English, which is a new thing for us, right? And so it's kind of neutralizing the idea that Americans don't like subtitles, and that foreign content won't travel to the US. In fact, before 3%, there really had never been a show from Brazil that had ever been distributed in any sort of meaningful way in the US. So all of this is very, very early days for us, and it's super exciting. None of the data is conclusive, it's just indicative that there's audience demand for these things, right? So let me go up level a little bit, and then I really do want to get into Q&A because it's the most fun part. Long Italian speeches accepted. So here's another thought piece, which is that 5% of the world's population has English as their primary language, right? But what percentage of TV internationally is distributed out of the US and the UK relative to every other market in the world? I don't know what it is exactly. It's 70%, maybe 80%, maybe more. And I am here to tell you that I don't think that that can possibly hold. I think it has to be an act of hubris to think that somehow Americans and the Brits are 25 times better at telling stories than the rest of the world. It just doesn't track, right? And so what's really happened is that you had an industry in the US and you had an industry in the UK that were very good at doing TV shows, very good at creating with great writers and an infrastructure, and then a mechanism to distribute that stuff through linear TV outwards. And meanwhile, you had voices in Italy, in Scandi, and other parts of Europe that didn't have the global platforms that were easy. It was not super easy to get a show like Gomorrah, for example, onto linear channels at the same time around the world to be part of these global conversations. And so really, on-demand and the internet is changing all of that, but it's sort of like the first 5 minutes in a football game. Like it's really changing it in ways that we can't even understand yet. What we do know is that, or at least I can say what our interests are, is that we don't want to recapitulate stories from the US in a different format in Europe. So a lot of what we end up getting presented to us from producers is, here's a cop show, and there's detectives from different parts of Europe, and they're all in it together, and it's a little bit like CSI or something like that. I think it's an interesting way to get a show financed. It's less likely for us to be a distinct voice that will have a distinct point of view that we believe could travel. So let me give you some examples of things that have been interesting to us, just as kind of thought starters. So we had, I mentioned Sabura and the great performance we had last night, and this idea, Marco, before he got on stage, was talking about the different dialects that the Roman characters in the show have. So there's a Sinti dialect, and there's kind of an old aristocracy dialect in Rome, and then there's different voices in between. And he said, I don't know if people around the world would pick that up, but Romans will. But I'm here to tell you that they absolutely will pick it up. They might pick it up on a subconscious level, but they will know that there's something authentic and distinct about those characters, in the same way that there's subtleties of a show like The Wire. And so I think nuance matters to us, and ambition matters to us. So we have a show that we're premiering next week at the Toronto Film Festival called Dark, and it's out of Germany. And Germany, traditionally you'll see a lot of crime shows out of Germany. What interested us was we're working with Bo and Yanti, who created this film called Who Am I, which was an amazing, amazing film. They had this idea of doing a show where a child goes missing, a different child emerges dead who's wearing things from the 80s in the pilot. And it turns out that there's this tunnel cave that's connecting 3 different time periods in German history. So we're doing a show that's set in the 50s and the 80s and present times with a supernatural element that is reflective in some ways of German history and German culture. I told Bo and Yanti at the pitch, and this was an American just sticking his foot in his mouth. It's like, oh my gosh, this is an incredibly ambitious project, and the blood came out of his face. He said, we don't use words like ambitious in Germany. It was like a bad word, but I thought it was interesting. So we're happy to have our ambitious German project premiering in Toronto. Narcos. When you talk about Narcos to people in the US, they don't think of it as a Spanish language series. They think of it as among a list of shows that are Netflix originals. The reality is that if you were actually to break down the scripts, over 85% of that series is in Spanish. And it debunks the idea that Americans aren't going to read subtitles. And it's part of this global storytelling, right? So huge in France and Italy, Spain, huge in Latin America, but heavily watched in the US. And again, not super intuitive. I don't think if you look back 5 years ago that you'd think that a big US network would have put a show that's almost entirely in Spanish on air. And yet it's gathered a big, big audience. And interestingly, we can take iterations of this thing. So Jose Padilla, who was the lead director in the first season and one of the creators of Narcos, who also did Elite Squad, which was an amazing movie in Brazil, came to us after that and said, I want to do something on the Brazilian political corruption scandal and get inside the chase of how this unfolded out of this gas station in a small city in Brazil. And we were like, I don't know if this will ever get on the radar of the group in the US. And we're like, absolutely, that story should be told. And that show will come out next Q1 for us. When you look at it, the production values and the ambition is amazing. And it's going to be, our belief is it's going to be a hugely impactful show around the world in Portuguese about a very specifically Brazilian topic. And how exciting is it that we as a group can tell these types of stories now. So it's exciting for us. A few other ideas, and then I'm going to stop.
Eric, there are at least 10 seats available here. The two first, you're in the back.
Come on in.
Come on in, don't be shy.
No. When we also think about international storytelling, sometimes what we're trying to do is just get access to really interesting material that hasn't really been exploited before. We're working on a project now out of Poland called The Witcher. The Witcher will be a truly international production. It's going to involve people from a bunch of different nations. It's based on a Polish set of fantasy short stories and novels. There's also a video game that was done on it that was sold 25 million copies. When we made the announcement that we were going to be developing this series out of Poland, it was the #1 trending topic in Eastern Europe on social media. We spend a lot of time looking at social media, by the way. It was also the #1 trending topic in Germany and Scandinavia, but it was top 5 around the world as well, in the US and Latin America and Brazil. Brazil's always the most excited about everything that we do, for some reason. 2 days ago, so when we think about international originals, for sure the majority of what we're going to be doing is working with producers in local markets. But I think what you're going to see is the distinction between a local production and something that's international is going to blur. And there's going to be these hybrids, right? And so 2 days ago we announced a show called The Eddy, which we're going to be shooting in Paris with Damien Chazelle, the director of La La Land and Whiplash, and Damien's a young director who set I think he set the record for the most Oscar nominations for a single film. His family is French. His father, I think, was born in France, and he spent a lot of time in Paris. And he came to us and said, I have this story, we have this story, he's writing it with Jack Thorne, who's this great British writer. He's won a bunch of BAFTAs, this very pedigreed group of people. He came with a music composer who had won a bunch of Grammys, so I was in this room and I was like, it made me feel a little insufficient, because I hadn't won a Grammy or an Oscar or a BAFTA or any of these things. So I was starry-eyed, but he came to us and said, we want to do this show set in a French nightclub. There's an American owner, and a French Arabic owner, and a group of French musicians, and they all have their backstories, and we got deep into it. And he said, could we do a show that's a combination of French and Arabic and English set in Paris? And we said, yes, absolutely. There's going to be an audience for people for this type of programming if it's done well. and we believe that, and we don't know how that audience will gather, but we know that there will be intuitively an audience for something that's a unique story, even if it's told in 3 different languages. One more, and then I'm going to wrap up. We have a show in Korea called Kingdom. And this was a filmmaker. The filmmaker had done The Tunnel, which was one of the top films in Korea a couple years ago, and a writer who had done a series that we love called Signals, that wanted to tell a story in Korean that they thought had big potential, that was a combination of a royal court, soap opera, drama from 500 years ago with zombies. So the kings and queens are cruel enough to the people that eventually kind of an undead emerges, and it's politics and Walking Dead and all this stuff mashed together. And again, for us to be successful doing this, we have to believe that Koreans are going to love the show, but that there's inherently going to be an interest in court intrigue and zombies on a global basis. So those are a bunch of things that we're working on, just to give you thoughts on what we're excited about. Here's what we do know. 3 things just to leave you with. One is the audiences around the world are becoming increasingly savvy about what they consume. And thankfully for you guys, it's a great time to be a producer, and thankfully for the consumer, it's a great time to get access to global storytelling. But it makes our jobs really hard because the audiences really can't be duped. And they know when something feels authentic, they know when something feels edgy, and they can tell when something has just been put together because the financing dictates that it's been put together a certain way. And so we're trying to cut through the chase and really find storytelling that we feel is very specific to a part of the world that can only be told in that part of the world, right? Subura could only be told in Rome with the politicians and the church and the gangs there, but that have a global appeal. We know that Netflix won't be 100% perfect on their shows. So sometimes you get this sense of like conviction in how people talk about their programming strategy. Like our conviction is that we have to be aggressive in our big markets in Europe. So we want to be developing shows in France and Germany and Italy and Spain. But really it's going to be iterative. So we're going to launch a bunch of shows. We hope that a lot of them work, but some of them won't, and that's okay. And then we know that if you look at internet companies, you know that if you look at Facebook, if you look at YouTube, places like that, that about 80% of their audience is outside of the US. And right now we're about 50-50. But that we're cognizant that a lot of our growth is going to come from our international markets. And when we think about Europe in particular, we're going to be reasonably big investors. So we've sort of indicated to the market in some reports that happened over the weekend that we're going to be announcing 7 or 8 additional series out of Europe in addition to the ones that we've already announced. So we have shows that will be coming in Poland, in Sweden, a couple more shows in France, a couple more shows in Italy. And our goal is to get to a place where we're going to be doing over, I would say, 20, 25 scripted series per year out of Europe, excluding the UK, and then quite a bit more in the UK as well. So we're busy. We're very excited about the opportunity at hand. I'm going to stop there.
Eric, thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to shoot you. Alexandra and myself 3-4 questions, and then we'll leave the sort of Q&A with the audience. We spoke earlier. By the way, there are a few seats available here in front if you want to. We spoke earlier about this article on the Washington Post of a few weeks ago that, by the way, Washington Post belongs to Jeff Bezos, that is the owner of, coincidentally, of Amazon. Interesting. Who said, Netflix is producing so much, is acquiring rights of so many properties, but has yet to come up with, I think what he said, a distinctive identity. And I thought, and I had a conversation with somebody that works at Australia, I said, this is such a misconception of what's happening, and it seems like it's not taking in consideration the reality how the audiovisual world is evolving. So can you elaborate on that a little bit, and also tell us how the algorithm is part of the new evolution of audiovisual, I don't want to say television.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that an identity is 3 or 4 shows that are put together is really a product of the world of linear, where you have a fall programming schedule and a spring programming schedule, and you're trying to connect audiences across that channel. So it makes perfect sense that you would have a channel in the U.S. that has unscripted shows of housewives that you're trying to connect those audiences across 4 or 5 different shows, and it's logical. Our perspective is that we're proudly not trying to be one thing to all people. Part of the reason why we're so aggressive in commissioning shows is that we know that our users are going to have very different experiences, right? And so, a household where there's young kids, I have an 18-month-old son and a 6-month-old son, so thankfully they haven't become addicted to TV yet. But when I talk to parents, they're going to be heavy on our original kids programming. So we have over 100 commissions of animated kids series alone. There's going to be a branch of people that are really only interested in anime, right? So we're commissioning 12 or 13 anime series that are all going to launch globally on Netflix next year. There'll be a track of people that love crime series, and the algorithms that you're talking about really help people identify shows that connect the dots between those things. So there may be a track of people who like Breaking Bad, then Narcos, then Sabura. And so the short answer to that question is that because we're trying to provide lots of different types of experiences for lots of different consumers, we will by definition not have a single identity in our original programming.
Thank you. There is another thing. A few weeks ago we had an issue that we were trying to solve about showing the end credits and trying to find a formula that satisfied everybody, auteurs, us, you, and etc. And I was having a conversation with one of your executives, Brian, and he said, Marco, I don't think we can guarantee that because we have 800 engineers working every day to improve the service. And I said, you know what, there isn't much that I can add to that, or I can counter if you have 800 top engineers. But I think that looking at how your service, your platform works, and compared to other pay TV, or you can sense that. There is everything seems to be working so smooth. You want to have the subtitles in English, you can do it, and everything is so seamless. And how this unbelievable strive toward excellence in technology parallels you were struck to excellence in your area. What are you doing, in other words, to have a better control of your editorial, of the products that you commission?
So one thing is that, and this is different than other companies that I've worked for, Netflix has a single business model, right? So we're a subscription on-demand service. We don't do advertising. We don't really do live programming. We don't sell things on a transactional basis. And so, when you think about the product, really we're focused, because if this doesn't go well, then we're not going to be a successful business, right? So it's almost out of need and passion that we just have to do one thing super well. When it comes to how this relates to programming, I think of the same mentality for our group, which is this group that I'm part of is responsible for finding shows around the world, and we have to do that one thing specifically very well. And I think that our approach to it has been to hire executives to build out a team that's both has experience in U.S. production, because a lot of our partners in Latin America and other parts of the world are asking for their thoughts on how to structure shows. But increasingly, it's also like, how do we build out teams on a regional basis around the world, so that that we're not tone deaf about how we think about programming. And so we're building out a team in Amsterdam that will have several creative executives and business executives, so that as opportunities come up, we're a couple hours away from any place we need to go. We have a team in Singapore, so that's the same thinking for Southeast Asia, as well as Sao Paulo and Brazil. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a kind of a singular focus, obsession type of thing.
Alexandra, before going to the audience.
Yes, when you mentioned the show that you commissioned, you spoke a lot about countries. Are you more targeting countries or subjects?